Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Pierre-Jean Esmieu-Fournel, who has an really interesting background as an investment banker working in New York and London and Paris, France. He's got a degree in business from one of the top, the top university in Europe. Is a foreign affairs expert, at least likes to think he is, and wants to talk about Ukraine. We had a conversation about American foreign policy recently that got a lot of attention, and so he wants to delve in and focus really right on Ukraine and what caused the issue and what the potential solutions are from a European businessman. Pierre-Jean, welcome to the show.
You're welcome, Brian. It's a real pleasure.
So tell me, why do you have this interest in what's going on in Ukraine, and what's your answer to the conflict?
Well, the reason for that interest is that there is a very low probability, but there is one, that it would turn into a nuclear conflict. So maybe we can talk about it, but I've got 4 kids, and frankly, I'm ashamed of what's going on and what's the West in general, including the US, including France, the UK, and Germany, has done vis-a-vis this conflict. And that puts us with our children in a very difficult situation, risky situation.
So you're obviously a pacifist, or you want to be an appeasement person?
Well, like everyone else, I'm surely a pacifist. But when it comes to the origin of the situation, you remember 1989. I'm sure you remember 1989, when the wall in Berlin collapsed, and when Gorbachev met, it was the first time he met Ronald Reagan in good terms, because, of course, Reagan was very, very happy with the situation. And the only thing that Gorbachev cared about was to keep his role within a Russia that was falling apart, falling to pieces. But during this meeting, it's very interesting what was said. It was said by Gorbachev to Ronald Reagan, hey, do whatever you like with the 15 or so countries that I'm going to give it back to the West, but please don't develop NATO. Don't put at our frontiers a nuclear missile that could go to Moscow in a very short period of time. So it comes back to 1989, and the US has done differently. Remember what happened in 2001, in 2007, when 7 countries from the West enrolled, became part of NATO. And then when you got that in mind, you say, why the hell do we, because we have this responsibility, you in Canada, me in France, because maybe I didn't speak enough about the situation and left NATO run the way. But we didn't need that. And Putin, and God knows I'm not a supporter of Putin, but Putin put it in a letter in 2021, that was a year before the conflict, and he wrote, it was an official letter that was published at the United Nations, and he said 2 things. I don't want to expand. I am not a Russian hegemonist. I am not the old Russia. I don't want to develop my country like we used to in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. I'm very happy with my territories. I want to keep my job. But please, there's one thing we cannot negotiate. Don't put Ukraine in NATO, item number 1. And item number 2, write a commitment, put it to the press, to the Western press, that if you were to enroll another country in NATO, and if I would agree, you would agree not to put launch missile close to the frontier. So there was 2 points in this letter, which is a very famous letter. We didn't follow it. We thought that it was, how can I say, it was not serious about the threat. Here what happened.
So you're effectively saying the expansion of NATO is to blame for the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
I think there's 2 key elements. The first one you mentioned is about the alignment, the possibility to belong to NATO. And I'm going to explain why a step further, if I may, Brett. The second one is about liberalism. we, the West, and I'm really talking now the entire West, not only the USA, we have this attitude where we want all countries in the world to abide by the principle of capitalism, liberalism. So the second item was that a good portion of the Ukraine people wanted also to be part of the European Union. But what people forget to say is that the European Union is an economic insurance for growth. It's an open market. It's great, but there is also articles of war within the European Union that basically say the same thing as Article 5 within NATO. Article 5 in NATO says basically that if you're a member of the NATO and if you attack, the 30 other countries of NATO are at war against the people who attacked you. So that's where
both the expansion of NATO and the potential expansion, the potential expansion of NATO and the potential expansion of the European Union were the cause of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Well, and of course, I'm not the only one saying so. If you go back to Bucharest, that was a very famous international congress in April 2008. In April 2008, the head of NATO, which is basically the USA, came to the conference and said, "Hey, great news, everybody!" Again, the same mistake. That was a policy called the open door policy. The open door policy is, hey, whoever is on Earth, I'm joking, but even somebody in China could try to belong to NATO. It's an open door policy. And when the open door was made by the head of NATO, i.e. by the USA in 2008 in Bucharest, Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, number one in France, Nicolas Sarkozy, President of France, the head of in Russia, in Moscow, the representative of Moscow, of the USA in Moscow, said the same thing. They said to the US and NATO, it's an act of war. So people that nobody can say they're supportive of Putin acknowledge that this decision was a declaration of war.
So you're saying that Merkel and Sarkozy said announcing NATO expansion was an act of war?
More specifically, the act of war was, as you say, but very specifically about Ukraine. Ukraine was the thing not to be touched. Why? Well, it goes down to a very simple thing. A lot of people now consider that the years 50s to 90s were the best years in terms of avoidance of war because of nuclear threat. Why? Because it's one thing to talk about nuclear threat and the equilibrium between one country that would launch a missile to the other and the other one being able to retaliate. Now, the retaliation concept is very important because if you can send your missile and the other cannot react in due course, well, basically there is no, the nuclear missile could be used because there would not be any retaliation. Now, everybody knows that if you decide to send a missile from the US, from Moscow, wherever you want on the planet, you need 3 minutes to ignite the missile. Then you need about 10 minutes to put liquid oxygen in order to go up. So altogether, it takes, once you've recognized a threat, it takes at least 15 minutes to be launched. When you send a missile from Ukraine, the north of Ukraine, to Moscow, it takes 12 minutes. As a result, it's the worst protection that we have because we, our US citizen, could send a missile to Moscow without being retaliated, without being annihilated. Of course, we are from the West, so we're going to say it's never going to happen. But when you think about a negotiation, I always think that you need to know what's in the head of the other people with whom you're negotiating. As a result, the threat was important. It was acknowledged by a very prominent politician in the world, and it was not listened to.
Fascinating thesis. So given that thesis, what do you think the result is? What should we do right now?
If I knew, the simple answer is I don't know. But what I could guess is that my best scenario would be there will not be a peace situation within the medium term, within the next 1 or 2 or 3 years. The only thing that can happen within a year, roughly, I'm talking in reference with the elections in the US, of course, because we're going to talk about it, but Trump's got very specific ideas about the conflict. But basically what I'm saying is that maybe within a year, there could be what I would call a freeze of the conflict, which will be will stop to fight to each other, but the situation is frozen, i.e., the territories are not given to one of the parties, be it the Ukraine, be it the Russia. No major change in the political situation, a little bit of reconstruction, but a very messy situation. Yeah, that's my read. Donald Trump has published several times that once he be elected, the next day, he said 24 hours after the conflict will end. He cannot do that. He could say that 6 months ago, but with the US have invested so much in the conflict, in money, in weapons, in presence, in political situation. I don't see it happening.
I don't see it happening either. But let's talk about it, because I disagree with your thesis, but it's an interesting one, and I want to delve into it more, and I want to give you some counterpoints to your thesis. And I want to talk about, how Trump could possibly end the war so quickly, which I think would be a disaster for the United States and for the Western world if he actually went through with that possibility, that threat. But we've got to take a message for messages. We got to take a break for messages and come back in just 2 minutes and discuss this further. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes with PJ from France. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Pierre-Jean Esmieu-Fournel, who is an investment banker. He runs his own merchant bank, raising money, raising capital for companies around the world out of Paris, France. He's got really quite an illustrious career working in banking in London, New York, as well as Paris. He's also been CFO of a biotech company, a medical company in Paris with operations around the world. And he's a foreign affairs expert. He's got an interesting background academically as well as in business. And I think he's been exposed to a lot of different politics as he's lived and worked and studied around the world. Not all that I agree with, but an interesting view. And we've had the privilege of debating politics and economics and business in different bars and restaurants in several different cities around the world. Excuse me. PJ, welcome back to the show. So we were talking before the break about your thesis that really the cause of the Russian invasion of Ukraine was because, number one, the potential of an expansion of NATO into Ukraine, and number two, the potential expansion of the European Union into Ukraine, both of which you say have stipulations comparable to Article 5 in the NATO agreement that says that if one country is attacked, all countries are attacked, and you have to declare war and participate in the attack. I want to challenge that if I could. So, Putin himself has said that it was to combat Nazism within Ukraine and root out the Nazis that were anti-Semitic and were racist against Jewish people. He also declared that Ukraine didn't exist, the culture didn't exist, the people didn't exist. They really were part of Russia, and that they were always part of Russia before. And he went back in history and saying that they were one people, and that they didn't have a separate organization, separate country, separate nationality, separate culture. And then he frankly, you take a look at the history where they've assumed Crimea, assumed militarily without a lot of opposition most of eastern Ukraine, and in the past have taken over Ukraine, tried to take over Ukraine through political means, through putting in puppet governments, through supporting different political parties, through trying to put in their own chosen people. He has had a practice, Russia has had a practice, and Putin has had a practice for the last 50 years since 1989 of trying to sassoon Ukraine.
Well, you know what? I would not differ with you. I'd say 95% of what you say is correct. But bear in mind another couple of points, if I may. Do you remember what happened in the early 50s in Ukraine? Well, that's when our dear friend Joseph Stalin, he died in 53, decided to have famine in Ukraine, which killed about 6 million people. So the story of Ukraine with the rest of Russia at this time is a very tricky one, because sometimes they say things like Putin did, which doesn't make any sense. Of course, this country's got a background, got an history, a culture. And the country was not treated in a nice way in the 50s when it happened. It was a huge disaster. I'm talking 5-6 million people.
I think
so
that's the Holodomor in the 30s.
There was the 30s also, and the 50s, yeah.
So you're saying there? So I'm only aware of the Holodomor in the 30s. You're saying there was another famine in the 50s?
I'm pretty sure, because it was Stalin, and Stalin took power. I took power in 26, 27, so you might be right. I may be wrong on the date. But my point, okay, granted, but my point is that Ukraine and the rest of what became the USSR were having relationships that were very difficult to understand for the West Europe. The other thing that you could acknowledge is that all the goods produced by Ukraine were sent to Moscow as a priority and were not distributed within the country. So they always treated Ukraine as a not equal partner during all these processes and time. But they did something pretty good in 1989, which was a decision which was faster developed by Bill Clinton at that time, if I'm not wrong with the dates. And he pushed Ukraine to stop and to avoid any nuclear missile in their country. So they stopped the production of nuclear missile, and also they removed what they had. So they were a nuclear-free country after 10 years. And if you remember, President Clinton was so happy and proud of this progress, because there were basically less nuclear weapons on the planet. Well, he recognized a couple of months ago that was the biggest mistake of his life, because he thinks, and I tend to agree with him, is that if Ukraine had kept their nuclear missile, well, I think that Putin would have thought a little bit longer, a little bit more before invading. So all the story is very complicated.
Well, but let's talk about that for a second, because I think this is really critical. And you probably know the history facts better than I, but there was an agreement, maybe at Bucharest, I'm not sure, where Ukraine did agree to give up all of its nuclear weapons and, frankly, ship them back to Russia. And at that time, the United States, the UK, Russia agreed that if anyone ever invaded Ukraine, because they no longer had nuclear weapons, that the other countries would defend the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So was the mistake taking the nuclear weapons out of Ukraine, or was the mistake that people didn't honor what they wrote and what they signed, the agreement they made? Maybe you shouldn't renege on an agreement.
This is great. I love it so much, Brian. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying, well, I can defend another thesis, which is the following. So item number one, I'm relying on the judgment of one of the most prominent presidents in the U.S. No,
I don't disagree, and I think that the lesson has been learned by Iran, by North Korea, by other people, and it's a bad lesson, which is keep nuclear weapons or get nuclear weapons and keep them, and because then you won't get invaded, and you can't trust countries when they sign agreements saying that they're not going to allow you to be invaded, and they're going to protect you if you are invaded. And you've focused on this Article 5 of NATO, and I think that it is a very strong article. But the reality is, we signed something. At least the United States and the UK signed something, said that they would protect the territorial integrity of Ukraine if ever invaded, and they didn't honor it.
But the mere fact of having signed this agreement, which was signed protecting Ukraine by major Western countries from a military standpoint, that was not honored. This agreement should never, ever have been discussed nor signed in the first place, for a very simple reason. It's my story with retaliation. in this case, the discussion was if Putin invade 1 square meter in Ukraine, is you got huge Western countries that will be on the back. But there's nothing in between. There's no negotiation. Now, when you want to negotiate something in your life, private life, business life, you always get room for negotiation. In this case, it was a binary agreement. It was only peace or war and nothing in between. So it was not exploited, because if the US and the UK had followed their commitment, well, there would have been a nuclear war. Because the reason why there's no nuclear war in Ukraine is very simple. None of the Western troops are on the soil of Ukraine. If we were to have French soldiers in Kiev, we would probably jump into a direct confrontation with Russia, and as a result with nuclear. So it was nice for the US to say, hey guys, forget about your weapon, we're going to protect you. But that was not something that should have been considered in the first place. Big mistake, another one.
Well, maybe, but it was a signed agreement that was signed by, my understanding, the United States, the UK, and Russia, all agreeing that Ukraine would never lose its territorial integrity. And this was all as a result of persuading Ukraine to give up its nuclear status, which was something that the world wanted at that point in time. It didn't want more countries proliferating nuclear warheads and nuclear ownership. And I think that was the right thing at that time. And to persuade someone to give up your nuclear power, which is, as you've described extremely well, an incredible deterrent, I think it makes sense that you provide some sort of guarantees. The problem is that those guarantees are, it would appear, not worth the paper they're written on. And I think that's the problem. But let's come back to your point about that you think that the problem is that the Russian people and Putin couldn't handle to have NATO or the EC in Ukraine. None of those things was going to happen at the time, 2-3 years ago. Both of those things look far more probable today. I don't think that that NATO was rushing headlong into an expansion into Ukraine. They may have talked about it, but they weren't rushing headlong. And the EC was not either. Nor was NATO talking about going to Finland or Sweden. And so what Putin has accomplished is actually the opposite of what he was hoping. What you've had is unification of NATO. You've had unification to a certain extent of the European Union, and you've had expansion of those as Finland, as Sweden, as Ukraine has looked at Russia versus the West, NATO, and the European Commission, and said, we want this one, not to be back in the Russian orbit. Putin has actually harmed himself and accelerated the expansion of NATO and the European Union by his actions.
Well, I can't agree more. Just one thing, though, because I'm still on the theme that, well, he said it to us. He warned us over the last 25 years. One example I didn't quote so far, which is, I think, a huge example. So this famous Congress of Bucharest in April 2008, when the NATO representatives say, hey, we confirmed that the door is open to Ukraine and Georgia at that time. Well, Putin published an answer to that, saying it was an act of war, I explained, etc. And what he did 5 months later, he invaded Georgia. So he sent a strong signal about Ukraine, which is, well, you're envisaging to surround me with NATO countries. Well, I'm going to show you what I can do on the small one and wait for the second. So all that was, anybody could have guessed what happened, really.
You see, I see things differently than you. I think that the Georgia invasion is sort of comparable to the German takeover of Austria, and then potentially the in what was it, the mid-1930s, late 1930s, and the attack of Ukraine is either well, at least the attack of the takeover of Crimea and the attack of eastern Ukraine is sort of like the takeover of Czechoslovakia, and then clearly the attack on Ukraine is in February of 2020. What was it? Is sort of like the attack on Poland in September 1st of 1939. I worry that history repeats itself, and that what what you're suggesting and what I really worry Trump is suggesting is what Chamberlain tried in Munich. Appeasement. And saying, yeah, you can take this, but don't go farther. Once you tell people you can take this, but don't go farther, they go farther. And that's the same with any bully. That's the same with, you know that in business. You got to stand up. You can't be an appeaser. You can't say, take Czechoslovakia and go no farther. Oh, well, Austria too. Well, okay, maybe Poland too. You can't say take Georgia, take Ukraine, and don't go farther. All that you're doing is providing the lesson. Keep taking more and going farther, because we'll never stand up.
So, we discussed last time about 10 huge mistakes in U.S. foreign policy. They all had in common, Brian, that the intention was good. It was about liberalism. It was about democracy. That was fine. But at the end of the day, on these 10 major conflicts, I'm talking about Iraq, I'm talking about Afghanistan, I'm talking about Vietnam, etc. Every time the first intention converted into a conflict in some part of the world, and then within a year to 20 years, when the conflict ended, because population are fed up with that. That's also something we need to talk about. But at the end of the day, we end up being in the same situation that was the one before the conflict started. So in terms of philosophy, in terms of wanting to do the famous thing in English I love is, I want to do the right thing. So doing the right thing is fine, but it doesn't work. So you got to question yourself and say, should I have invaded Afghanistan, Iraq? Should I have helped Ukraine in the conflict? I'm very pragmatic. Maybe that's my point. I'm very pragmatic. I have no judgment about what has been done in the past. There were some reasons, good or bad. But I think that's where I stand on that. I love your talk about Chamberlain. So Chamberlain was the prime minister in 1938, and at that time, you're completely right. Adolf Hitler had, I'd say, well, I'm going to invade Czechoslovakia. Okay. And that was, well, Austria, you mentioned Austria. Austria was not a subject because there was no conflict. He went with his car through the frontier and that was invaded. There was no gun, nothing. But it was very important what happened in Czechoslovakia. And you're right. Chamberlain should never, ever have given up. He should have declared war at that time for the simple reason that if he had done so, the German troops would have lacked 18 months of production of war materials. So this is no question from an historical standpoint. He should have done that. But the comparable doesn't exist between the two situations, because I don't think, and there is no proof, contrary to what I'm going to say, I don't think that and that's going to be huge for you, my friend, but I don't think that Vladimir Putin is in the shoes of an old Tsar that would like to conquer the rest of Eastern Europe back to the nice days of the 60s and the 70s. I don't think he's got that in mind. So there is no second step after Ukraine. If we agree with Ukraine reaching a standstill, we remove our help on weapons and we try to have some kind of peace arrangement. I don't see another move after this one, which is a big difference with the Second World War.
I think that's going to be the biggest difference between your opinion on what's happening and mine. And the reality is neither of us know. But I worry that the opposite is the prognosis of appeasement and or of defeat in Ukraine. But let's take a break for some messages, come back and discuss that. Fascinating conversation today with PJ. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm chatting tonight with a Paris, France-based investment banker. His name is Pierre-Jean Esmieu-Fournel, and he's one of the brightest guys that I've had the privilege of working with. Very smart guy. Don't agree with him on a lot of things. In business, we had lots of disagreements as well, but he's smart, and I like debating with him. We've just been chatting, PJ, about your belief that Putin is not an imperialistic czar, and so therefore, if he's successful in Ukraine, won't expand. And I want to challenge that, because I've interviewed several experts on Eastern Europe, and they would look at what Putin has done with Georgia, what Putin has done in several of the stands countries on the periphery of Russia that were formerly part of the Soviet Union that are effectively back part of some sort of amalgamation. What he has done with Belarus, where he has a very close partnership, if not almost a partnership, almost like the former USSR. How there's Russian troops stationed in Moldova, if Russia continues its invasion of Ukraine, Moldova might be next, and lots of them that say that the Baltics are next. And there are sizable Russian minority populations in several of the Baltic states, and he would have potentially an excuse to protect them, to invade some of those Baltic states. Obviously, I think Finland and Sweden saw some threats with the long undefended border between their country and Russia, which is far longer than the border between Ukraine and Russia, and felt that it was critically important to join NATO. I think that Putin, from day one, and there's articles that have been written by Putin and speeches that he's made, that he saw that the collapse of the USSR was one of the biggest mistakes in history, particularly Russian history. That he likes himself to the czars. That he believes in Greater Russia. He certainly believes that Ukraine and the Ukrainian people are part of Russia. And frankly, he believes that the Russian Orthodox Church rules over a far wider, jurisdiction than just Russia, and believes it is a more important, more powerful, more persuasive, if that's the right word, religion than other religions, Ukrainian Catholic religions. So I think the opposite of you. I think Putin and several people, if not lots of people in the establishment in Russia, believe in Greater Russia, believe in the USSR, believe in the Tsarist attitude. And I think it's comparable to Hitler and a lot of people within that organization, Nazism, SS, etc., that believed in Greater Germany.
Can I raise, I beg to differ on this point. And just want to focus on one thing. Let's go back to Ukraine and think about it. Because if Putin had in mind to conquer Ukraine, which is not proved from an historical standpoint, and maybe that will be the first step to then invade the Baltic states, as you say. Well, I'm not in agreement with that for a simple reason. When he invaded nearly 2 years ago now, he put on the frontier 190,000 Russian soldiers. Now, we have examples in the past. You mentioned Poland. When Hitler invaded Poland, he put 1.5 million soldiers in the country in order to invade the country, and bear in mind, to maintain its power in the country. So it's one thing to invade, and then you have to stabilize and leave a lot of soldiers in order to maintain your power. Now, when Hitler did that in 1939, he had to only conquer half of the country, because a lot of people forget about it, but Russian took the other piece, the eastern piece of Poland. So what I'm saying is that if you look into the work of John Mersheimer, which is a resident at the University of Chicago in international politics, he went to Princeton, etc. He's very, very reputable and knowledgeable. He's saying that if Putin would have wanted to conquer the whole of Ukraine, he should have needed 3 million soldiers. So he put 15% of the required amount of soldiers. So in all, well, my thinking, he didn't want to conquer the full of the country. That's my argument.
No, I don't buy it. I apologize. He got to the suburbs of Kiev within 2 or 3 days. I think that it was the heroism of the Ukrainian opposition that I think everyone in the world was shocked with. And frankly, a couple of very smart acts. For what I understand that there was some advance intelligence that led the Ukrainian forces to destroy one of the major airports in Ukraine, and make it impossible for Russian forces to land and take over that airport. And that if that airport had been taken over, which was attacked on the very first day of the invasion, then Russia would have had far easier going of it in invading Kiev. And so I think that there were a couple of masterful defensive strokes that Ukraine, and just the heroism of the soldiers, even with armaments and munitions that were very inadequate relative to Russia. You've seen, and I've seen the lineup of all of the military equipment coming in from Belarus and from Russia that was dumb. It was just in a line on a highway, and it was blocked and struck. And so I think that the vaunted Russian military expertise may have not been as smart as some people feared it was. I do think that Putin clearly wanted to take over Kiev, and in that regard, maybe the eastern half of Russia. Maybe he didn't have ambitions right then to take over all of Ukraine. And as well as I have done a fair amount of business in Ukraine. There was, before the war, a very sizable Russian-speaking population that a lot of Russians thought of as Russian, even though they were very proud Ukrainians. They just spoke Russian because Russia was the country that they were part of with the Soviet Union, excuse me, for what was it, 50 years, and so they spoke Russian. Now, again, Putin has accelerated the unification of Ukraine. Russian-speaking Ukrainians are learning Ukrainian and are speaking Ukrainian today. It's interesting because there's this comparison at times between Russia and Canada, or Ukraine and Canada, and Russia and the United States. There are 1 in 4 Ukrainians that have a blood relative in Russia. There are 1 in 4 Canadians that have a blood relative in the United States. There's an incredible amount of cross-border marriage relatives, association, blood relatives, etc. And a lot of people thought because of that, there would never be an attack. I've spoken to numerous different people in the Ukraine that don't even speak to their relatives in Russia anymore, that the animosity is profound, that the stories they are listening to and believing in Russia are ludicrous, but they won't listen to reason, and they won't listen to their relatives that are telling them that people are being raped and murdered, and that the Russian military is attacking for expansionist reasons, not to denazify Ukraine. So I think that you're wrong. I honestly believe that Putin wants Greater Russia, wants the USSR back, and if we don't stop him here, if the West doesn't stop him here, I think that totalitarianism, authoritarianism, communism, or at least Putin's version of it, will expand in Eastern Europe.
I think I think most of the countries surrounding the west side of Russia now are anchored within the liberalism value, European Union and NATO. So I don't see that happening.
PJ, how can you say that when you've got authoritarian leaders in Hungary that are supportive of Russia, someone in Slovakia that was just elected that is supportive of Russia, a party in Poland that may not have been supportive of Russia, but that was extremely right-wing and authoritarian. I think that there are, and worldwide, you've got authoritarian leaders elected in where is it, Argentina, and elsewhere, that are following the strongman, populist, authoritarian strategies of Putin. We really are going two ways in the world today. You keep on coming back to 1989. After 1989, there was this famous article written by Francis Fukuyama about the end of history, where he said, liberal democracy has won the battle in history between fascism, communism, socialism, and free market democratic neoliberalism, capitalism. Well, it hasn't. We've got authoritarian states in China, North Korea, Iran, Hamas in Gaza, in Argentina, in Hungary, in Turkey, in Slovakia.
I do really trust the awareness and the good in general in the Western populations That's I didn't phrase it properly, but that was a word from Abraham Lincoln, because there was some problems that he said, well, I'm going to rely on my citizens because at the end of the day, they're going to make the good choice. When you mention these events in Hungary, well, it doesn't come from that. In Hungary, it comes from the fact that they don't want to send weaponry to Ukraine. It's a bit different. But what I truly think, and we lived it in France, I don't know if you know that, but over the last 40 years, the extreme right political party in France jumped from 0.5% to 25%. And there was a risk that my country, which I love, could have turned out into an right extremist country. So I'm like Abraham Lincoln. You're right to mention these risks, but I think at the end of the day, all this population will make the right decision. There's no way for me to prove that. It's just, I truly think it's, at the end of the day, democracy, as Winston Churchill said. Winston Churchill is the worst of the regime, but it's the only one there is. So with that given, I still feel optimistic. You remember this story of the Cuban missile? Because nobody's got that in mind, but JFK threats the world for 13 days, and it was close to a nuclear blast because Khrushchev has shipped nuclear missiles in Cuba. And the reasoning of JFK was very simple. As I said half an hour ago, the launch of the missile was so close to Miami that the US didn't have time to retaliate. So it was a different game in terms of nuclear threat. It's what's happening now in Ukraine. If somebody from NATO launch a missile from Ukraine to Moscow, they don't have time to retaliate. And they should have time, because if they have time, they will not send a missile. That's my best argument. I don't know if it's right, but it's my best one.
Well, as I've discussed, I don't agree with you, but this is a good discussion. Anyway, now that we're in the situation that we're in, we're going to have to try to figure out how to end it. So let's take a break for some messages and come back with a couple final minutes and talk about what the blank do we do now. Stay with us, everyone. Back with PJ in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Chatting tonight about Ukraine and why Russia invaded. And my guest is PJ, an investment banker from Paris, France, who's got a contrary point of view to myself on the justification, or not the justification, but the rationale for Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. And we've debated that thoroughly over the course of the last 40 minutes or so. But now that we're in the situation we're in, I guess the biggest and most important question, PJ, no matter whether I'm right or you're right in why the situation is what it is, how do we get out of it? So what's your answer?
Yeah, my answer is I haven't got a clue, but I'm optimistic. I know it sounds contradictory. Let me give you just 2-minute story that I've never told you. My first job as investment banker was in Johannesburg. I spent 3 years in Johannesburg in South Africa. And it was in between the vote of the white people that were relinquishing the apartheid. So in other words, the black were allowed to vote and have the same status in the population. It was in 92. And I left in 94 at the moment of President Mandela was elected. So I was right in the middle of this crucial time for this country. No white people in the term of business. I was a banker. I was in the business world. No one thought that this could work out because population of the black was 80%. There was 20% AIDS in the country, just amazing. And there was 40% very poor people, less than $100 per month. It was an impossible thing. And of course, all the white people were trying to get money out of the country. Well, at the end of the day, President Mandela found some great solution. It wasn't all easy, but it worked out. It's one of the wealthiest countries in the world. One thing he did that nobody saw coming, he voted the law of oblivion, the law of forgiveness. And what it did is that you had white people that had raped girl age 4, 5, 6, killed people, had to testimony from their own will at the judgment that was all around the country. And as long like when you go to church, to a priest, and you say what you got to say, and then it's, well, if you truly think that you've done something wrong, then you're forgiven. And that's what happened, and the country felt very well, considering what happened. So I'm sure there will be something coming from a very clever politician. I have not identified these people yet.
So I think that it's interesting and instructive thinking about what Trump could possibly do when he brags that he could stop the war in 24 hours. And I think that the only answer would be some sort of Neville Chamberlain-like appeasement, where he gives Crimea, Eastern Ukraine to Putin. And I worry that would be, as I've discussed already, the worst possible thing. It would potentially stop the war now, but it would potentially create a far bigger, far worse war in the future. And so I think the only answer, regrettably, is to keep fighting. And unlike Japan and Germany in World War II, I don't think you need to have an unconditional surrender, because I don't think that you have to actually invade Russia. I do think you need to move Russia back to the pre what was it, 2014 borders, and I do think that Crimea is part of what needs to be reconnected. To Ukraine. And I think it's going to take a while. And I think it's going to take continued Western support. And I think it's going to take even more advanced military equipment. But I don't think there's any other answer. I worry that any kind of appeasement, any kind of granting of land to Russia is giving into a bully, is agreeing with the strategy of appeasement, and I think it's a mistake. And I do think, as the Secretary of Defense in the United States has said, and maybe has mistakenly said publicly, if you believe that Russia is one of the 2 or 3 biggest threats in the world today, having them at war for a while and using up their munitions and using up their military equipment and losing some people is actually a good thing for society, is a good thing for history, is a good thing for the world.
Our biggest threat is not Russia, it's China. And it's going to be big in 10 years, because projections demonstrate that their military potential will exceed the USA. So I would not go into this game that you suggest, because they're getting bigger and bigger. And that's where the real risk is for us on the Western side. That's China going forward.
Well, there's a candidate for a Republican primary in the Republican primary for president that is a businessman that agrees with you completely. And so it sounds like that's your political persuasion. PJ, it's been a real pleasure chatting with you. Thank you so much.
Same.
You know what? Another continued good debate where we've got different points of view, but I like that. That's kind of fun.
Sure do. So thank you so much, my friend. Bye-bye.
All the best. That's our show for tonight, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Paris, France, at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos are available on my website, briancrombie.com. Good night, everybody. Thanks, PJ. Great to see you.